our next speaker is Sandra. Hi, Sandra, how are you? So Sandra Kentish her field is very close to mine. She's a membrane scientist. We know each other for very long. And she is a completely different field. She's from chemical engineering. She has the experience in the industry and academia. I think he can talk in a quite different way in the what are the challenges that we face and so. Thank you very much. And she's really have been a very strong name in membrane science and really active in different ways. Thank you, Sandra, for being part of our discussion today.
Thank you, Susanna, and I really would like to make this interactive. So if you are online and would like to ask me any questions, please raise your hand and then we'll make sure that you can unmute. So I'll stop about halfway through for questions. So feel free, if you, as I go through my presentation, if you do think of questions, whether you're live or in the audience, feel free to put your hand up. But I thought I'd start in a little way, the same way as Yoko just did, talking a little bit about my own journey, because it has been a very non-linear path. Many women don't take traditional career paths that some of their male colleagues do, and I'm certainly one of those people. So let me start. You'll work out how old I am if I tell you that I did my Bachelor's of Chemical Engineering, finishing in 1983. So if you can work it out, I'm now 60, so I'm no longer a spring chicken. However, back then when I did my chemical engineering degree, and this may be true still for many women, it was quite unusual for me to do that as a female. And so having had to fight a few battles to be allowed to do that degree, I felt it very important to actually be an engineer once I graduated. So even though I topped my class and there was a lot of pressure on me to do a PhD, I chose to go into industry. So I spent 2 years working in a petrochemical company as a process engineer. I then moved to Kodak, Australasia, and of course this company really no longer exists. But at the time, back in the 1980s, I was responsible for, involved with making Kodacolor film. And I actually grew to a position where I was production supervisor and won a more challenging supervision role there because I was in charge of 2 shifts of 9 men each, working on day and afternoon shift. So again, a reasonably challenging situation as a female to be supervising a workforce of 18 blue-collar men. However, towards the end of that period, I was starting to think about having children, and I was recognising that this was not necessarily a role that I could continue while I was having young children. So at this point, and also because I'd promised I would do it, I headed back to the university and I started what I thought would be my PhD. But like many people probably, I didn't get on that well with my supervisor in the end. So I wrote that up as a master's degree and moved on to a different topic. However, this is where another problem that many of us, well, another situation that many of us face. I started to have children. So I had my first child in 1991 and my second in 1993. However, I continued on to do my PhD. I was working part-time throughout that PhD with a bit of a maternity leave gap in there. But in the midst of all this, I came across another problem, and I think is common to many female researchers in the audience, and that is what I refer to as the two-body problem. Specifically, one evening, my husband came home and said, "I've just been offered this wonderful promotion. It's just fantastic. Double the salary. However, it's not in Melbourne." And so halfway through my PhD, I relocated to Mount Gambier. And now just to give you a feel of what I mean by that, here's a map of Australia. I've spent most of my life here in Melbourne, which is a city of 3 to 4 million people. But at this point, I was forced to relocate, or I had to relocate to this little town here, population of 30,000 people, 5 hours drive from Melbourne, 5 hours drive from Adelaide, literally in the middle of nowhere. However, I did manage to finish my PhD remotely. Now, at the time, everybody would have said, oh, would have been extremely difficult to do. But again, I'm sure many people in the audience would be aware that this has become almost a normality for many of our PhD researchers during COVID. So many people now have had to do exactly what I had to do, pivot towards a simulation-based PhD and complete my studies from that position. Having finished my PhD, I was still stuck in the middle of nowhere. So I ended up working for the next 3 years at the pulp mill that was 50 kilometres down the road from Mount Gambier. Again, I was still working part-time, but I worked as a technical assistant there for 3 years. Not a very fancy job, just the best I could get, given the situation. In the year 1999, I managed to convince my husband that it was time we headed back to somewhere where I could get a better job. And so in 2000, I managed to pick up a 1-year contract, replacing somebody who'd gone on maternity leave. And I chose to work at 60% of full time. So you'll note that even by now, my children were 7 and 9. I still wanted to work part time. My children, I still saw as quite a priority, and I was prepared to accept a part-time position on that basis. So in fact, I was allowed to continue beyond the first year. I managed to keep my foothold inside the university. And I worked at 60% of full-time till the end of 2003. I then had 2 years at 80% of full-time before moving in 2006. I finally moved to a full-time position, essentially as my children were starting high school. However, things then became much easier, if you like, and in 2012 I was promoted to a full professor, and I also became head of department. In 2017, I was promoted to head of school, and in 2019, I was promoted to distinguished professor. So I'm now part of quite a small group of distinguished professors at my university, which is, you know, the top-ranked university in Australia and highly ranked around the world. So the message I'm trying to get across here is that it is possible to be successful in spite of what might be seen as many hurdles today. So I did have career breaks. I worked part-time for a long, long time. And I also stayed at the one university. These days, there tends to be pressure on you to go and get that international postdoc to move around. But I was able to complete my career essentially always working at the one university. How did I manage some of these achievements? I do think there's lots of things to keep in mind. Firstly, I was lucky to have a strong mentor. He was actually my PhD supervisor. He was the one who, when I first walked into his office and said, I'm going to have to quit my PhD, we're moving to Mount Gambier, he said, we'll work it out, we'll sort it out. And so I did stay in that position rather than leaving academia. But he's also been a sponsor, and this is different to a mentor. A sponsor is somebody who advocates on your behalf. So he was the one who said to my the current head of department, that we needed to give me that 60% position on a 1-year contract. He was the one who introduced me to people who were important to my own career and said to those people that, you know, I was worth being offered positions in X, Y, and Z. What's important also is having strong collaborators, particularly when you are working part-time, so that the research can continue ticking over even when you're not in the laboratory. But being part of that, it's important that you therefore have a very wide range of networks that allows you to develop those collaborations and identify your mentors. So this is probably one of the most important things that I see as important. I never say no to the opportunity to meet new people, being that at a meeting with industry or at a function. Getting that chance to expand your networks is really, really important. But finally, I would add that you do have to work hard. It's not that this is necessarily easy. As an example, even when I was 60% of full-time, that allowed me to take 2 days a week between, say, 9 and 6 p.m, where I would be with my children, and I would, go to school and do the reading classes and all the rest of it that you want to do as a mother. But I would still log onto the computer at 7 o'clock and work until, 10 or 11. I would still probably actually do 40 hours a week when I was 60% of full time, but I felt I had the flexibility to prioritise my children when I wanted to. And so now when I'm working full time, I probably still put in 60 or 70 hours a week. Which is relatively unusual in Australia, although I know in many Asian countries that is the expectation. Now, I did notice that we're supposed to be talking about how to get more women, how do we retain more women into the system. So I wanted to also pause and talk a little bit what I try and do now in my role as head of school. So I'm now in charge of a group of maybe 50 academic staff, or a bit more than that, well, another 50 research fellows, and 100 or 150 PhD students. And we do have a lot of women within my school. And I think the way we do that, or the way we retain those women, is predominantly by developing a collaborative culture. So I look around some of the other faculties within engineering or schools within my own faculty, and there's very much a case of male ego being dominant. And so I think it's really important that you have a different culture, and that requires a minimum number of women before it generates that sort of a feel. So it's quite difficult if you're an isolated female working within a completely male culture. But once you get that sort of critical mass of women, then you can develop a culture that's much more conducive to retaining women. I do try, based on what I just showed you, to provide the mentors and the mentorship that people need, whether that's myself or looking more broadly. And similarly, I aim to provide sponsorship. I do try and ensure that workloads are distributed evenly. Women have a huge tendency not to be able to say no. They say yes too often. And that can mean that they are overrepresented on committees. And so you've really got to make sure that that doesn't happen. One of the issues facing us in this particular area is that at my university and at many other universities, there's an expectation that committees are gender balanced, particularly selection committees for faculty positions. And if you're in an engineering faculty, it can be that you're the only female that can go on those committees. And so you can spend an awful amount of time acting as the gender balance. And we need to be very conscious of that and make sure that if that is the case, that, there's compensation for workload elsewhere. Similarly, there's a tendency for women to be very good at teaching, and that's great, but it doesn't help to advance your research career. So I push quite strongly to make sure that women aren't doing more than their fair share of teaching. And obviously, given my own experience, accommodating part-time positions and maternity leave is critical. And finally, of course, the aim should be to lead by example, which I try and do both in my research and in my leadership activities. Now, I have got more slides, but they tend to focus on my research. So, Susanna, if I can, I wanted to just pause there and see if people do have any questions. I can't see any coming up in the participants list, but I don't know whether you've got anybody there.
We have here some questions already. Please. So first,
I'll stop.
Say, yeah, we just see we just see the super successful Sandra. No? It's good to know what is your path to reach there. No, it's okay. I start with the question. Yeah, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. I have a question about, like, I see that you had many pullbacks and some kinds of struggles through your career, and I wanted to know what is the fuel for you to continue and not surrender through all of those obstacles that you face? Because you, like, as you said, like you decided to do a master's and then you say, no, I can continue with a PhD. So yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I'll respond to that in 2 ways. Firstly, I think I possibly had it easier than younger women today because there was no expectation that I would ever be successful. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say there was no expectations. Yeah, I suppose I mean that I could become a distinguished professor. I always thought that I was going, when I first started as an academic, I really thought I was going back to teach because I'd managed to do a bit of teaching during my PhD and really enjoyed it. So I think never expecting that I would be as successful as I've ended up being has been probably the critical thing. I just sort of got on with things and aimed to do as well as I could, but really not expecting to be able to get promoted or to achieve anything significant. And maybe that's a problem with a lot of women, in that we don't tend to have confidence in our own abilities. But in some sense, it meant that I didn't really, I don't know, stop and think about what I was doing and overthink it.
Okay, well, please. Here, please. Oh, yeah, I can give you mine.
Good morning, Sandra. Thank you very much for this very inspiring speech that you had. Actually, I don't have a question, but I would like to relate on your point about the mentorship. I myself feel really the importance of the mentorship. There was a time, actually around 2000, I went to the US, newly married, not knowing what I'm going to do, what type of academic program I need to join. At the time, I wanted to join my master's. I didn't have any scholarships, funds, nothing. And just, finding the right mentor, she was able to guide me through. She was able to get me into the right program, provided grants for me. Seriously, she was, I think she was one of the main factors for my success. Now I'm a PhD assistant professor. I do my research. And I always look back into that mentor who really made this, happen by that support. So yes, I agree with you. Mentorship is very, very important. And thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. Go on, Sandra.
Sorry, I can see questions coming online. I can see the questions online. So perhaps if I read out the first one from Fathia. So she's asked, as a woman in academia, what are the difficulties you face as a mother, and how do mothers in academia overcome these obstacles? And I think the biggest difficulty for me was handling the out-of-the-box situation. So, you put your child in childcare, your child's there from, most of the day, 9 to 5, but then you get the phone call at 2 in the afternoon. And I know this has been particularly bad during COVID, of your child's got a runny nose, you have to come and pick them up. And you would have to drop what you were doing at work and go and deal with that situation. So it was those unusual circumstances that were probably the most difficult thing to handle as a mother. And I do think, again, having understanding bosses, also having the flexibility of being a researcher and within a university. Again, I would say that situation was much, much worse when you were in industry. I said I worked at Kimberly-Clark. I was there. I was 50 kilometres away from my children in childcare. And in an industrial position where you couldn't really leave. I was lucky in that case that my husband was able to assist, but it's probably those that are the most difficult. And so overcoming them, I do think is mainly around time management, allowing yourself the time to be able to handle those situations, whether that's going part-time or just working hard. And also making sure that you're in a culture where your boss is understanding of those situations. And if you have a supervisor who's not understanding, move somewhere else. So that was the first question. I've got another one here, which says, you spoke about the collaborative culture. Are there any laws that support and strengthen this culture? Not that I'm aware of. Again, in Australia at the moment, and possibly everywhere else, you've probably heard about the Me Too culture. That is certainly those types of initiatives where, you know, there's a bigger sense of needing to have a collaborative culture assist. But I really think it's about the leadership styles that you produce, and how you go about leading a group of people that establishes those that collaborative culture. Now, I've just lost track. Do you want me to keep going here, Susanna?
Yeah. If you see the questions, yeah, go on.
No, actually, no. There's no more. I've answered all the ones online. There's yes. No. If you've got any more there, or otherwise, I have got more slides, but
yeah, there's a question here. Please.
Hello, Sandra, how are you? I don't know what time it is right now at your end, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever. Sandra, I have a question for you. First of all, my name is Nadia Bakhorji, and I too have a long career, so I can completely sympathize and empathize and feel what you've had to face over the years to achieve such great success. Did you have the support of any women's groups, and how was your success greeted by female colleagues? Were they very supportive? Did you find challenges coming from the ladies as well as the men? It's an interesting dynamic, and I wondered how you coped with that.
Yes, and again, I'm thinking in my head about 3 points to respond to that. I've never had any issues with my immediate female colleagues. They've all been extremely supportive. And in fact, you know, a lot of those women now report to me, or the other way around. So we have individually, we have tended to feed off each other, and I think that's part of that collaborative culture. But I also wanted to point out that I went through unconscious bias training a few years ago, and I don't know whether people are aware of what I'm talking about, but we all carry this unconscious bias. And what I realised then is that women are probably harder on women than they are men. So in the sense that and I realise this now myself, when I was reviewing a resume looking to appoint someone, I was intrinsically saying to myself, well, if this is a female, they have to reach a higher bar, because I know how hard it is to be a woman in this situation. And so I was asking more of the women that I was interviewing for positions that I was asking of the equivalent male. And this is a tendency of a lot of us to have this unconscious bias. And it's been shown that women suffer from this as much as men do. So I've since then been very careful not to do that, that you really need to not overlay your own experiences, if you like, on women that you're trying to appoint, that they, you know, they should be allowed to fail as much as men, but there can be this sense of that being not correct, if you like. I did want to also make one other point, though, is, and you talked about women's groups. I have tended to avoid them like the plague, if I can be blunt. So, you know, women in engineering groups, or, and I really say that because I found early on when I was involved in those groups, they can tend to be a bit of a session of whinging about all the men in the world or something. I don't know how to describe it, but I think that if you are going to compete in a gendered world where there are men and women, then putting yourself in a room with just the women isn't necessarily the right thing to do. I mean, you socialise with women and you sort of you know, day to day there's those interactions, but I'm not a big fan of groups that are specifically advocating for women for the sake of it. But I'm open to people who want to tell me I'm wrong.
No, I fully understand. So anyone?
I've got another one here coming up on the Q&A. I said, I saw that you had your children during your master's and PhD. It's like a full-time job or even more. How did you manage being away from your children for a long time at a young age? I didn't find it that big a struggle doing my PhD while I had young children. I mean, they were in childcare a couple of days a week. And there were issues a little bit when I was in Mount Gambier. But I think I found it actually really good in that it gave me the thinking time. I know this sounds obscure, but I'd be changing a nappy and I'd be thinking through about the experiment I'd done yesterday, and it actually gave me the time to, you know, to do all that thinking that is an essential part of your PhD. So in that sense, it actually worked well, but I do understand I was enrolled part-time, so I had, I think you could see from the timeline, I finished it in about 4 years, but I had the flexibility of taking up to 6 years. So I didn't feel the time pressure that I needed to get it done. But, you know, ultimately, I think you're organised, you do have that thinking time when you're not, you know, you are looking after the children or something, but your brain capacity is still working. And so for me, it was very effective, but maybe I'm unusual.
Any other question? I want to give her time to, oh, yes, I think the discussion is being so.
That's fine. I don't have to present the research slides. So I'm happy to keep talking. We have to bring you here for talking on research again when this word becomes a bit normal.
Thank you, Sandra. It was inspiring speech. So I have a question. I am a PhD student. I am a mom of twins. So it's a difficult job, to be honest. So how do you face the emotional challenge that maybe you face it during your work in the field dominated by men? So sometimes you need like a moment to just not thinking about your children or your experience. You just need that time for yourself. So like there is like emotional coming, but you need like a moment, but in the same time you need like move on faster than you think. So how you can face that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I can really answer the question that you've got. Maybe I could comment that women do express their emotions differently. So I have cried in front of my colleagues, but only once or twice. You know, you can, you know, we need to be in a world where you can experience those, react to people in a different way than a male might react. But in terms of handling the children, I think you need to have an understanding boss or a PhD supervisor who can handle a situation to say where you suddenly need to get on the phone to a child is probably what you do these days. But yeah, I don't know whether I had emotional issues in terms of the children, but I think it's just a matter of compartmentalising that part of your life while you are at work. And say, except for occasionally you do get that phone call of the children are unwell. But I do admire you having twins while you're doing your PhD, because I think that would be twice as challenging as the situation that I face.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe, Sandra, you can have a few minutes to give your final words.
I don't really know whether it's worth it.
Yeah, it has been so excited. Yeah, go on.
I'll let you, I don't even know where I was up to. I'll just, no, look, it's probably not worth it. By the time I get started, let me just talk a little bit about my research rather than showing slides.
Okay. Yes, just
so I work in polymeric membrane technology, similar to Susanna. So a polymer membrane is simply a piece of plastic, if you like, through which some particles move, but others are retained. And I suppose if you think about the research I've done, I've been lucky, probably because of my industry experience, that I operate over a very broad range of research. So I do molecular level research where I understand the chemistry of what's going on, but I'm not a materials scientist and I don't spend a lot of time in that area. I spend much more time dealing with commercial membrane materials. Again, possibly because of my industrial background, I am aware that most materials that people are playing with will never be commercialized. So I'd rather work on the ones that are in the field. So I spend a lot of time understanding how materials that are already being used operate and what are the issues associated with them. And as part of that, I take my research out, I do pilot plant trials on site in factories, both in water treatment, milk, dairy processing, carbon capture and storage. And I also do simulations of the full-scale process. But I can see that my time is just coming to an end, so I'm going to stop there. I'll give a chance for any last question.
Yes.
I can see one more. It's just somebody talking about whether creating women groups of solidarity may be the only way to move forward. For me, that's not the way to go, but I understand every culture is different. I think it was really interesting hearing about the Japanese culture, and I think there are a lot more issues there. So I think they have their play. It's not for me, but I do understand where other people need those support groups of women. So, yeah, but I'll finish there, Susanna, because we'll let you keep to time.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to interact with you, and I hope to see you at KAUST in the near future, that we can bring you back again. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Thank you.